This is a podcast from Seven Vineyard.
It's great to be with you, and for those of you who I haven't met, I'm Dan. I'm married to Karen. We've got 3 kids, and we live in Bedminster, or technically we live in Ashton. We're on the Ashton side of North Street, not the Southville side, if any of you are familiar with those local community dynamics. It's very important, apparently, which side of North Street you're on. I work with a charity in Bristol called Bridges for Communities, and we are all about connecting people of different cultures and faiths. And alongside that, I have a bit of a side hustle, which is called cross-cultural training. Some of you might have never heard of that before. A friend of mine jokes that it's just about telling people what kind of plugs they need in different countries. And I've tried to tell him repeatedly, there's a bit more to it than that. But that's kind of what's stuck in his head of what I do. A lot of it is about helping people to adjust to new contexts and cultures. I got interested in this because I grew up in India, spent 14 years there, and then Karen and I spent time in the Middle East. Such a learning journey and learning opportunity that it kind of made me very curious about what culture is and how it impacts us. But when people move, because of work or life to a different country, they're keen to understand how to make a good impression, how to fit in, how to feel at home. And it often brings up the topic of greetings. Okay, greetings are an important part of culture and of social expectations and social norms when we meet people. So I've actually been observing a little bit today as I kind of came in and as I've seen each of you greeting each other, the range of ways in which we greet in this country. I've seen and received a few warm hugs. I've seen and received a few more awkward side hugs. There's been a few fist bumps. There's been a few hellos. There's been the awkward handshake that turns into a hug, and then you're not quite sure what you're meant to be doing. We're actually kind of known around the world for our awkwardness, because in the UK, it's really not always clear what kind of greeting is appropriate or expected. So I've tried to be learning and observing, either as I've traveled or as I've done these training sessions and listened to different trainers around the world about some of the ways that greetings happen in different countries and kind of what is the norm or what is expected. So, in France or in Spain, apparently 2 kisses on the cheek, but not on the cheek, next to the cheek. And depending on where you are in France or whether you're in Spain, which cheek you start on, whether it's the right or the left. In India, where I lived, up north, putting your hands together and saying namaste. But if you're down south, then it might be another word like namaskaram or vanakkam, according to Daniel, gave me that little reminder in the break. In Saudi Arabia, you would typically put your hand over your heart and say salam alaikum, which means peace be upon you. But if you're really close, if you're a close relative, they might even touch noses. They'll kind of bump noses as a sign of extra respect and warmth. In South Korea, apparently, it's common to bow. And what you do with your hands, what kind of bow you do, and how low you bow is really directly related to the degree of respect that you're seeking to show the other person. So knowing these things, being aware of them, can help to reduce the anxiety of people who are moving to a different country. And it can help you avoid making a complete fool of yourself. And I have had my fair share of making a fool of myself and making mistakes. My children will never let me forget the time when we visited a Sikh family and I assumed that they were Muslim. And rather smugly, being aware that it was Eid on that day, I wished them all a happy Eid, to which the lady, corrected me and said, thank you, but we're not Muslim, we're Sikh. And my kids thought that was hilarious and have never let me forget it. If you've got an awkward greeting story, I bet I can outdo it, because I once greeted a Palestinian friend called Ahmed in the street, and we greeted each other with the cheek kisses, which is customary in the Arab world. But I used the Lebanese system, which is right, left, right, And he went with the Palestinian-Jordanian system, which is right, left, left, left. And our lips met in the middle in the high street. And just neither of us had been expecting it. Let's just put it that way. And as I said, here in the UK, we are quite confusing. Some of you who've moved to the country would know what I mean. Trying to navigate and understand what's expected in different contexts is complicated. So imagine, if I've gone to a friend's birthday party, they're good friends, I probably know automatically going in what is expected and appropriate. Probably I'll give them a big hug. If it's a lady, I might go for the air kiss next to the cheek. But imagine I then look over their shoulder and I see some of their other friends who I've met before, but I don't know well. Suddenly I've got this dilemma of what kind of greeting would be appropriate. A hug might be a bit too much. A handshake might be a bit too formal. And I have met them before, so I'm not introducing myself. Maybe I should go for the fist bump. Maybe I should just say hi. Maybe I should just try and ignore them because this is awkward. Okay? So it's complicated. There's so many factors you're weighing up kind of subconsciously around age, gender, previous relationship, previous interaction, what happened last time. The good news is that with us Brits, once we're past the kind of awkward initial greeting, we suddenly become more predictable. So defaulting to our favorite pastime or topic of conversation, which is, thank you very much, the weather. And you might not realize that there are expectations over how that goes, right? So we typically start with a kind of suggestion or question. Lovely day, isn't it? Right? Question mark. And what we expect back is confirmation or affirmation that what we've said is correct. Yes, it's beautiful. Love the sun. Oh, it's awful. And that kind of goes on. And, various people have identified it as a kind of bonding interaction where we're assessing whether the other person wants to engage in conversation or not, and to what degree. We might ask them, or we typically ask them how they are, to which the expected answer is fine or well. But if they say, I've been better, then we know to interpret that they are pretty much on their deathbed, but putting a brave face on it. So these are I think it's fascinating, these kind of interactions that go on and the expectations and the unwritten rules. That's the thing, is we don't often spell it out or explain it. And that makes it tricky to navigate. So greetings are an important part of our society and culture as they are around the world. And it was no different in the time of Jesus, in the society and culture that he lived in. So we're going to look at a story that really revolves around the role of greetings and social etiquette. It's a story in Luke chapter 7, from verse 36 to 50. It's one that you may well be familiar with. It's a simple story from the life of Jesus. And the longer I go on in my faith, the more questions I ask, the more things I wrestle with, the more I keep coming back to the simple stories of Jesus' life and his teaching. Someone once told me that the good news, or the gospel, equals Jesus plus nothing. And that's always stuck in my head, that the good news is a person. It's Jesus. It's him. It's who he is. It's how he relates to people. It's what he taught us. And it's not Jesus plus Christianity, or Jesus plus rules and expectations, or Jesus plus certain doctrine. It's really him. And so I want us to read it with that kind of lens of coming back to his life and his teaching. I think it will come up on the screen, or you can read along on your phones or your Bibles, but from verse 36. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. Tell me, teacher, he said. 2 people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now which of them will love him more? Simon replied, I suppose the one who has the bigger debt forgiven. You've judged correctly, Jesus said. Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, did you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman from the time I entered has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she's poured perfume on my feet. Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little, loves little. Then Jesus said to her, your sins are forgiven. The other guests began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. So there's a lot going on in this story, and I want to just do a quick kind of recap and pull out a few things that I've noticed as I read it again this week. And then I want to share a few questions that I've been thinking about and that I think we can think about as a community as we listen to God for what he might be saying to each of us through the story. Just to let you know, there is another very similar incident in the gospel accounts of Jesus' life, which is in the other three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and John, and it involves a woman anointing Jesus. She's named in John's Gospel as Mary, Mary of Bethany. But this story in Luke is almost definitely a different account, a different incident, okay? Because there are significant differences in when it occurs in Jesus' life, on whose house it takes place in, on what people are thinking of her as she carries out what she does. Okay, so don't get confused in kind of reading and looking at the other ones. Think of this as a separate incident. And the first thing really linked to our conversation about greetings and what is expected is that there is lots of awkwardness in this story. Okay, the obvious awkwardness is probably the big scene that the woman makes of washing his feet with her tears and wiping his feet with her hair in somebody else's house, and especially when you know a little bit about her background and what people thought of her, this was obviously awkward. But the truth is, this story is awkward from the moment that Jesus arrived in the house. Because in Middle Eastern society, now and also back then, hospitality was an incredibly important value. Okay, the way that you treat your guest says something not only about your respect for them as a guest, but about your own dignity and honor. So in this scene, the air is really filled with tension because of what didn't happen. As Jesus entered the house, all of the expected or traditional courtesies were omitted. There was no kiss of greeting, there was no provision of water to wash hands or feet, there was no olive oil with which to anoint your head. I guess in this country, the closest thing we can equate it to would be knocking on someone's door, that you're expected to visit. The door opens, but you are completely blanked. There is no handshake, no hug, no kiss, no let me take your coat or would you like a drink, just being completely blanked. It would feel odd, it would feel awkward. It might even be upsetting or insulting. And in Jesus' case, that would have been much more the case because of the expectations around hospitality and over who he was as a rabbi. So why did Simon and his mates do this? Just looking back over previous chapters, you would see that things hadn't been great between Jesus and the Pharisees or the religious leaders. Jesus had been proclaiming his message of love. He had been hanging out with people that society deemed to be sinful or beyond the pale. And this contrasted with the message of the Pharisees, who tended to emphasize that God loved those who do what is right. If you just go back to chapter 5, you'll see a couple of incidents in that chapter where that tension is kind of starting to build and ratchet up. And we can only speculate really about why they invited him, why Simon invited him for dinner. Perhaps it was to test him, to ask him some questions, to see if there was anything to his claim to be a prophet. Or perhaps it was to put him right. and to tell him that he really couldn't be keeping the kind of company that he was keeping. So that's the important kind of background to the story, is that when Jesus entered the house, those courtesies, which would have been customary and normal, were deliberately omitted. They were missed. And no one in the room could have missed that. And the woman in the story must have observed that taking place. Now, we don't know the woman's name, which is a shame, because of the kind of starring role that she plays in this story and the way that Jesus chooses to honor her. It would be nice to be able to name her. But many characters in the Gospels are not named. And the most likely reason for that is what we call protective anonymity, which basically means that many of them may have still been alive when the first accounts of Jesus' life and the Gospels began to circulate. Some of these people would have still been alive, and so therefore they may have been at risk as this Jewish revolution kind of gathered momentum, but also came under increasing persecution and oppression. So she's not named. We can only refer to her as the woman. She was most likely an uninvited guest, which was not unusual apparently in those days. Houses were quite open spaces. But we think she's uninvited because she's referred to as a sinful woman, and it's made clear, I think, by Simon's attitude towards her. We know that she's been present in the room since Jesus arrived because Jesus said to Simon, "From the time I came in, she hasn't stopped kissing my feet." So she's there, she's a witness to his public humiliation by his host. And it also seems that this woman, who was most likely a prostitute, must have previously met Jesus. She must have heard his message, received some sense of acceptance from him, because Jesus says to her, "Her many sins have been forgiven as her great love has shown." So the love that she's pouring out through this gesture is a response to something that has happened before. I don't think she's come in to beg for forgiveness. I don't think that's what this act is about. I think she's come to this dinner intending to honor him, to show her gratitude to him. And we're told that she brought a jar of perfume with her, probably planning to anoint his head and his hands. She probably didn't plan to wash his feet. Otherwise, she would have brought some water and a towel. So washing his feet was probably a response to the offense or the omission of the greetings or the kind of etiquette that would have been expected. And so at some point she kind of decides to take matters into her own hands and to go to Jesus and to cross all kinds of social and cultural boundaries to express her love and her thanks to him, and also probably her sense of upset around what had happened. In every story about Jesus, it's important to ask, in the light of the culture of the day, what would have been expected from him? And in this story, I think it's very easy to say that he would have been expected to be embarrassed, what she was doing, of letting down her hair, which would have normally been covered, of touching him, someone on the fringe of society touching a rabbi. Everyone in the room would just assume that he would deem these to be unacceptable. And in some way, he would communicate that or judge that. But he doesn't. And to the amazement of the entire crowd, he doesn't object to what she has done. And in fact, he accepts and affirms her gesture. This was such an incredible act of acceptance and inclusion, and one I think that should set a precedent for us as Jesus followers, or at least be something that we think about. In accepting the actions of the woman, Jesus is breaking all kinds of social expectations, and then he goes and breaks another one, which is criticizing his host, which I don't think is a great idea anywhere around the world. I haven't come across that yet in my cross-cultural training as a recommendation. Criticizing your host doesn't tend to go down well, but that's exactly what Jesus does, gently but pointedly. First, he tells a parable to Simon about two people who are in debt. The point being that Simon hasn't shown love in the same way that the woman has. And then he says, "You didn't give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You didn't give me a kiss, but this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You didn't put oil on my head, but she's poured perfume on my feet. And he then addresses the woman again and affirms her and speaks words of love over her. So that's the kind of dramatic and remarkable story as we see it. It wouldn't have been comfortable to be there and to witness. It would have been awkward, probably very tense, but that story has been preserved for us. And there are three questions, really, that have come to my mind this week as I've read through it and that I wanted to share with you. And the first one is, who might I be judging or excluding? You know, Simon watched what this woman did, allowing Jesus to touch him, washing his feet, and he thinks, if this man were a prophet, if this man were a prophet, he would know who the woman is that's touching him and what kind of woman she is, a sinner. In other words, he stands there watching this act of love and affection and emotion, but he has no compassion, no empathy. He's blind to the act of love that is taking place in front of him because he's caught up in analyzing and judging the situation and the people. He didn't exclude the woman from his home, but he definitely judged her. And he judged Jesus as well. And unfortunately for him, Luke chapter 7 comes after Luke chapter 6, which is a summary of the Sermon on the Mount, some of Jesus' teaching. And it includes this teaching: do not judge, and you will not be judged. Why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own? This is one of Jesus' most memorable sayings, I think. And he had a lot to say on this topic of judgment. And this story in the next chapter shows us what it looks like. It kind of brings it to life. And the story refers to the woman as a sinful woman, but the truth is that the room was occupied by two different types of sinners: by law keepers and by law breakers. These days we might say rule keepers and rule breakers. And this is a dynamic that you might be familiar with, right? Each of us is different, and some of us might be more inclined towards one than towards the other. I know in our household, I'm more naturally a rule keeper. I find it more difficult, more uncomfortable to bend or break rules. Karen, on the other hand, well, you can talk to her about rule breaking anytime. Just kidding. The thing is, rule keepers often condemn or judge rule breakers as being bad people or being selfish. You know, why should you have a different standard applied to you when everybody else is doing something else? We kind of assume that rules are in place because someone has identified that they were needed, or society has agreed that this was a good thing. So when we see someone breaking it or invited to break it, we feel uncomfortable. On the other hand, people who are rule breakers might look at rule keepers and think hypocrites, you know, because they might know that something different is going on in our thoughts, or they might think we're foolish, or they might think we're just a stickler for rules that don't exist for a good reason. So whichever side of the fence you fall, I think this story challenges us around our attitude, around judgment, and that we need to stay humble. Jesus was so radical in including people who society, especially the religious in society, felt were beyond God's love. Just this chapter, we don't have time to go back and look at it, but just this chapter of Luke chapter 7 contains 3 different stories about people who would have been seen as outsiders, but were the unexpected recipients of Jesus' love and acceptance. There's a centurion, so an occupying soldier, whose servant was sick, that Jesus heals. There's a widow whose son had died, so someone who would have been seen as outside of God's blessing. And there is this woman that we're reading about today. And I think Owen's been reminding us in his series on Acts, Jesus' acceptance and inclusion of people was nothing short of revolutionary. You know, turning upside down the beliefs and values of much of society and challenging the status quo. So I think this story, and everyone like it, should give me pause for thought and should force me really to stop and ask, who might I be judging? Or who might I have a judgmental attitude towards? And you may think, I don't really judge people. I wonder, have you ever stood behind a single mum in a supermarket checkout buying junk food for her kids and thought, well, I'm glad my family eat healthier than that? Have you ever looked at someone with a really nice car and thought, well, they must be a bit materialistic. They're obviously just living for themselves. Have you ever looked at someone from a different culture and thought, that tradition they have is just weird or wrong? I'm glad we don't do that. Have you ever looked at teenagers in their matching tracksuits on e-scooters going down the street and thought, I wish they would just go home? Have you ever listened to a colleague who gets drunk every weekend and then comes in and boasts about it and thought, well, I'm glad I'm not like that? I know I've thought some of those thoughts, and I think this is how it creeps in small and subtle ways. Symptoms of a proud and judgmental heart, not a humble and thankful one like the woman's. The second question, very briefly, that this story makes me think about is, what kind of faith is God looking for? Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you. But what did he mean by that? In the first story in chapter 7, that centurion had faith that Jesus could heal his servant. In the second story, it was Jesus' faith that raised the widow's son. It was nobody else's, as far as we can tell. And in this story, it looks like the woman's faith has apparently saved her. And there's this kind of weird pattern, as you look at this and you think about what God requires of us or responds to in us, in Jesus' life and miracles, where sometimes it's the person's faith in him, sometimes it's somebody else's faith on their behalf, and sometimes it's just Jesus acting, kind of out of the blue or without any apparent response from the other. And I actually love that, because it means that we can't kind of nail it down or turn it into a formula and say, well, this kind of faith leads to this kind of response from God. There's a lot more mystery in it than that, I think. Jesus affirms that it's the woman's faith that saved her, but what was that? Was it her thoughts about him? Was it her beliefs? Did she think or know that he was the Messiah? Did she think or believe that there was something of God in him? Did she think or believe that her sins were going to be forgiven by him? We simply don't know. All we get to know is that she experienced something of him, and that there was perhaps something special about him, and she moved towards him with love. And her faith was borne out in action. That's what we get to know about the faith of this woman. And maybe that's all we get to know. The final question, so that one was about what kind of faith is God looking for from me? The last one is my heart a thankful one? This striking image of the woman washing Jesus' feet with her tears, wiping them with her hair, pouring perfume on them. It's just such a powerful picture of love and of gratitude. It's likely, as I've said, that she was acting partly in response to what she had seen and what Simon had done or not done for Jesus. But it also seems clear that she came with that intention of showing her gratitude towards him for the love and the acceptance that she had already experienced from him in some way. And her actions stand in real contrast, don't they, to Simon, who was unable to see or respond to Jesus for who he was because of that tendency to judge or to analyze. She, on the other hand, just got on with the business of simply expressing her love and her thanks to him. And I think that's perhaps what God has most stirred in my heart as I've looked at this passage this week. Getting on with the business of simply loving God and expressing my thanks to him. I've heard this expressed by a few people recently, I think in our community group, in the worship team meeting that I went to, this sense that there is a desire in many of us to press in and to simply enjoy our relationship and our walk with God. Some of us have done lots of thinking, lots of asking questions and analyzing and questioning, all of which are good and valuable and necessary. But at the same time, we mustn't forget how to respond simply and passionately to God, pouring out our love and our affection. And that can look like 100 different things. Okay, we're all wired differently. We might express our thanks or our love to God in different ways. It can be through the week, but it can also be here on a Sunday when we gather together as a community. So I've actually asked David if he would come back up and lead us again in worship as a way of us responding to this passage and the actions of that amazing woman and Jesus' amazing acceptance and response to her. One of the ways in which we can express our love and our thanks to God is through singing. We've already been doing it, and it's historically been one of the ways that the church has expressed their love for God. It's not the only way, but it's one of them. So as we sing again, I just want to invite you to reflect on what we've seen in that passage. Allow God to speak to you as you sing to him, and maybe be asking those questions of who might I be judging or judgmental towards? What kind of faith is Jesus looking for from me this week? And is my heart a thankful one? Why don't we stand again? We'll worship for a few minutes and then we'll wrap up our service.